Ethical Perspectives on the News is produced by the Interreligious Council of Linn County, which is solely responsible for its content. The views and opinions expressed on this program do not necessarily reflect those of the staff and management of KCRG TV9.
Good day and welcome to Ethical Perspectives on the News. My name is Linn Tabak. I will moderate today's discussion. Our topic is the filibuster. This is a rule in the United States Senate. There are proposals to retire this rule, and it's stirred up a lot of debate. It's a subject with a long history. I have three people with us today to help us explore this issue. Megan Goldberg is my colleague at Cornell College. She teaches politics there, and I think you are in your second year, is that right? Okay, and I'm going to let her say a few more words about herself in a moment. And Laura Kamienski chaired the Linn County Republicans until recently. She has a degree in law. She interned in Congress at one point. And Bob Rush is a retired attorney, worked in Cedar Rapids for many years, served in our state's legislature, and once ran for Congress as well. So I invite each of you to say just a few more words to round out that picture of who you are, and then we'll start our discussion on the filibuster. You want to go first there, Megan?
Sure. So as you mentioned, I'm in my second year teaching at Cornell College. I teach all of our courses in American politics, including a course on Congress. And so because I teach all these courses, I've been following this debate closely and have long thought about the role of the filibuster. And I'm here to talk a little bit about what we know in political science about its history and sort of the power dynamics it produces.
Very good. Laura, you want to say a little bit more about your background and your interests here before we start?
Again, I have my law degree from the University of Chicago, and one summer during law school, I interned in the House of Representatives. So that's my Washington, D.C. experience, but I have many friends and colleagues who have been in the Senate, particularly working on nominations over the last few years.
Okay. And Bob, just a few words about yourself.
In a few words, I served in Washington, D.C. at the Justice Department. And I'm forever grateful to President Nixon for having made me a Democrat for life, as I was there during the Watergate years.
Okay, very good. All right, well, I'm going to begin with a little story and then invite you to help us define some words. I was surprised earlier this week. I had a student in my class who comes from the town where John Wayne was born. Nobody knew who John Wayne was, a very famous actor in the mid-20th century. And then I thought of, with this topic, I thought of the movie Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, and I found out that a lot of people don't know who Jimmy Stewart or Frank Capra is either. So I just say, there was a movie, 1939, that for many Americans of a certain generation at least, kind of defined what filibuster is. Jimmy Stewart played an earnest but naive man who's sent to the Senate and discovers that his colleagues are putting forth legislation just to enrich themselves. They're corrupt. So he stands up and he speaks round the clock to prevent the passage of this bill. So there's a big climax in the movie as he tries to keep himself upright for as long as possible. Now, that's not what the word filibuster means today in the United States Senate. So help us with that word filibuster. What does it mean in the present day in the United States Senate? Any one of you here? Bob, you want to try this one? Because I know Megan is.
Certainly. You won't find it.
Then Megan will grade your answer.
That's right.
You won't find that word in the U.S. Constitution. You won't find any thought of obstructionism in the Constitution or the writings of our founding fathers. It really, for the first 100 years of our democracy, rarely, if ever, came up. It's only in the last 100 years that the filibuster has taken on undue importance, and particularly so in the last 50 years.
Okay.
So that's a little bit.
So I looked this up, and the word comes from French or Spanish. It had some reference to pirates. There was an unusual etymology there. Megan, there's another word also from a foreign source that has confused me and might confuse other people watching the news, and it's related to filibuster. That word is cloture, spelled C-L-O-T-U-R, and it sounds like closure, might mean something like closure. Help us with that one.
It does. So in addition to not finding the word filibuster anywhere in the Constitution, you also, there's not actually a rule about filibustering. It's that, and the filibuster came about in, I think, 1804, when Aaron Burr thought that the rule in both the House and the Senate that allowed you to move to the previous question, which means let's close debate, let's vote on whatever it is we're discussing, that was redundant. And it was rarely used. And so he actually recommended, in the name of efficiency, that both the Senate and the House get rid of this rule. Only the Senate took that recommendation. And so what you actually have, the way we track whether or not a filibuster has happened, is actually based on whether or not cloture has been invoked. And so cloture is a call to end debate and vote. And you only really need it if something's being filibustered. And so that's often when you look at, there's no record of like how many times has something been filibustered in the Senate. What they actually have is a measure of how often cloture has been invoked and how many cloture votes have actually been taken.
Okay, so we should say here as well, I think you implied this, Megan, but we should say that both houses of Congress have the power in the Constitution, granted in the Constitution, to set their own rules for debate. And one of those rules must be a rule that says when we end the debate and take a vote. And that's what this is all about, right? Okay.
Right.
So
and the first filibuster, yes. And the first filibuster sort of happened after Aaron Burr had removed this or suggested removing this rule in the Senate. The Senate did that. And someone decided to just keep talking and talking and talking, effectively revealing the fact that there was this loophole that the Senate didn't have a way, at the time, a mechanism to close debate and vote.
Okay, Laura, you have anything to add here to help us with the vocabulary before we get to making arguments for and against? Are there more concepts that we have to understand?
I think it's important to understand that this is a rule in the Senate, as Megan mentioned, that if you can go back to the founders, while it's not mentioned in the Constitution, the Senate is set up very differently than the House, and it was intended to serve a different purpose. One of the common metaphors people use is the cup and saucer, that the House is the cup, but sometimes the tea gets too hot and boils over into the saucer that is the Senate to allow things to cool down a bit. So I think kind of the idea that the House and the Senate serve two different roles in our government is important to remember when we talk about this.
Yes, in my reading in preparation for this discussion, I went to the United States Senate's webpage, and the first thing I found at the top was this cup and saucer comparison. Yeah. Okay, so let's look at.
Can I jump in, Leon? Is that fine?
What's that?
Can I jump in? Is that fine? I have a lot of thoughts on the cup and saucer. So I use this analogy all the time. And I think that analogy is actually correct in some ways. I'll probably talk about this later, but I have some beef in talking about anything that was like pure intentions of the framers, because nothing that we actually have in our institutions came out of pure intentions at all. It's all political compromise. But setting that aside, that it's absolutely true that the House and the Senate are different institutions. They have different purposes. But the framers built in to the institutional design a lot of things to create that difference, that even if you took away the filibuster, which didn't exist at all for the first decade or so, but the fact that the Senate has longer terms, that they don't turn over every single 2 years, right, that it's staggered elections, and that there are fewer of them, and they have to serve wider, more diverse electorates. all of that contributes to those different designs that even if you got rid of the filibuster, which has not remained consistent since 1804, it's changed dramatically in both like the actual rules and the spirit of how it's used, you would still have those differences reflected in the way the House and the way the Senate are designed.
Okay. All right. So the filibuster today applies, it's an option in some cases, but not others. So I want you to talk about legislation, confirmation of nominations, budgetary matters. The rules are different for these different kinds of votes in the United States Senate. Can anybody help us clarify where is the filibuster significant today and where is the filibuster not an issue?
Leon, let me add just a little more historical perspective.
Sure, go ahead.
And
sure,
that is the filibuster came to its height in blocking civil rights legislation. In 1922, there was an anti-lynching bill. You would think, gosh, who's going to oppose that? Well, that bill was filibustered to death and killed. And then when civil rights legislation proposals started to pop up again in the 50s and the 60s, Southern Democrats combining with conservative Republicans in the North effectively blocked civil rights legislation for decades.
I disagree with that the conservative Republicans in the North were the ones that had a problem with civil rights legislation. That it was the old school Southern Democrats that had a problem with letting go of their slaves and that. And it was
I agree 100%.
For finally passing things like civil rights legislation.
But let's not forget Iowa's own Senator Burke Hickenlooper, who in fact was a conservative Republican, who in fact joined with Southern Democrats in filibustering civil rights proposals.
Right, and I think some discussion of the filibuster when they talk about the Civil Rights Act in particular, there's some modern commentary that talks about how the filibuster produced this bipartisan coalition, and isn't that so great that we could have a bipartisan coalition? But that bipartisan coalition was made up of a fractured Democratic Party in the middle of a partisan realignment. So yeah, there were these like Southern Democrats who opposed civil rights legislation, but those people became Republicans, right? The South is not a Democratic stronghold anymore. The party's essentially flipped. That's why, right, Lincoln was a Republican, but if Lincoln were walking around right now, he would not be a Republican. So I think that the party labels are, it's not wrong, but to argue that the Democratic Party and the Republican Party are like anything resembling their current iterations is not really taking into account this basic switch that happened, a realignment that happened really around racial politics.
I would argue that it was a pure switch, but that's getting us away from the filibuster. So we'll leave that for a future episode.
Well, to put an exclamation point on it, the record holder for the longest filibuster for a long time was Strom Thurmond, who was a Democrat and later, of course, flipped.
Which is a point I'd like to get to. That the Strom Thurmond filibuster on the Civil Rights Act is one of the classical examples of a filibuster, what people think of. And that's not at all what the filibuster is anymore. Now it's just that you have to get 60 votes for something. It's not back in the 50s and 60s when you actually had to hold the floor. You had to be standing up, speaking, not taking bathroom breaks, not, I need to sit down. So, there's something to be said for that kind of filibuster where you really had to care about what you were doing, right or wrong, good or bad. Versus today, as long as we just make sure we don't have 6 people casting a vote or 60 people casting a vote. It's very different today than it was back during World War I when it first really came to prominence for the civil rights struggles.
Okay, maybe I can add a little here and see if somebody wants to respond. Megan mentioned the 1964 Civil Rights Act. There was a recent exchange on the editorial pages of the Wall Street Journal. One essayist argued that the effect of the filibuster was to make a debate long enough that everybody felt they had been heard, so that Southerners were willing to accept this big change after the law was passed. And that was the good effect of the filibuster, to give everybody the sense that they had been heard, to allow some compromise, and then to, for the people of the country, to believe that that a consensus had been reached and they would accept that consensus. Now, this was immediately followed by a letter writer who contested that, but that was one of the arguments made here in favor of the filibuster. Anybody want to chime in on that?
Let me jump in on that, since I was in the South 5 years after those bills were passed, and I can assure you that passing the laws did not change one iota of attitude in the South. I litigated cases from Texas to South Carolina, Mississippi, and Alabama because the law was being ignored.
Okay.
I think on top of that, that particular piece, talks about how it really strengthened, like the framing was that the filibuster strengthened the Civil Rights Act. And I think that ignores, the fact that between 1917, which was the sort of the start of the modern filibuster, and 1964-65, political scientists have found that over half the bills that were killed by the filibuster were civil rights legislation. So that, and then if you combine that with the data, what we know about Black voter disenfranchisement, what we know about the loss of Black representatives at the state level, there were like 300 Black representatives in state legislatures in the South. And during the Jim Crow era, that plummeted to 0. So that's hundreds of Black Americans who should have been in office. And because the Black vote was disenfranchised, they were lost. So you have to weigh it. Like, sure, what if it did strengthen the Civil Rights Act in 1965? But it also, the filibuster meant that people for decades were disenfranchised. And so, if you make that frame, you also have to weigh it against the cost and loss of democracy in the American South.
But Linn, I think you're right. It was the Democrats that came along and made a fundamental change to the Senate rule on the filibuster when Obama was elected. And they changed.
Yeah, so let's talk about that. So the history I've seen, I want your comments here, Laura. There was a change in the rules in 2013 and again in 2017. So this is the point I was getting to before. The option of a filibuster to block confirmations of appointments was ended in 2013 for most appointments, but not for nominations to the Supreme Court. And the Democrats pushed that change. They saw the opportunity to confirm President Obama's appointees with a smaller majority if they could dispense with this rule. The two parties switched sides then. The Republicans gained a majority, and Democrats did not want to see Republicans with a thin majority confirming the appointments to the Supreme Court that President Trump made. So we've had that change, and now the issue is about ordinary legislation, is it not? We're blocking any bill, but there's still another option around it called reconciliation. So let's hear Laura about this recent history of confirming judges, first at the lower courts and then at the Supreme Court, and this back and forth between Democrats and Republicans defending and opposing this practice.
Well, I think this is really, I kind of think of the changes to the filibuster have been a bit of a game of chicken that, once the Democrats made that move, all bets were off, and whoever was in the majority is going to get what they want now, apparently. And it just keeps inching further and further away. And, are we to the point where it's wild swings either way every 2 years? Do we want that? There's something to be said for especially with judicial nominees, once upon a time it was, is the person qualified? Did they study and know and practice the law? Can they do that? Whereas now it's so partisan where, for the last 4 years we had Orange Man bad, anybody he nominates for anything, we can't vote for if we have a D after our name, no matter how eminently qualified they may be. And, it just, how far are we going to go in making these changes?
Well,
But I
keep
think
in mind, though, please go ahead.
I mean, I think that the filibuster has made the Senate effectively a supermajoritarian legislature. It requires now 60 votes, which there are constitutional scholars who have argued that that's actually unconstitutional because the Constitution stipulates that the Senate passes bills with a majority vote, not a supermajority. I also think that the wild swings is unlikely to happen at all, but also it's so arbitrary that if the cloture vote of 60 has changed over time. So what's an appropriately large majority so that things will be stable? I think that that history shows that this has entrenched policies, this has entrenched powered interests, and that the status quo is so far advantaged in the Senate that we can't get anything done, especially when it comes to polarization. And so I take your point about judicial nominations have become incredibly partisan, and that's not really what the intent was. That's not really good. That has bad outcomes for the legitimacy of the judicial branch, that has bad outcomes for a politicized judiciary. But I think that's also a little bit of a separate issue. And I think that, talking about the illegitimacy of a majority is just like a really interesting path to go down in a representative democracy.
Well, to add to that, the Republican Party in the Senate represents just 43% of the American population. So you already have a tyranny of the minority.
Well, again, we could bring the 17th Amendment into this, and do we really think that was a great idea? I'm sure I'm probably the only person that might say that was the beginning of some of these issues, some of these problems. But again, senators weren't elected directly. Senators were intended to represent their states, the state and the state interest. Again, we're not a pure democracy with mob rule. It's not always, that's why we have the electoral college as well, that certain people want to do away with now.
Right, but I think that is
and again, whether or not you think that's better or not, probably depends where you would come down on any number of these issues.
But I think the other thing is that the concern about an oppressive majority comes a lot from Federalist 10, written by James Madison. That's where he talks about the danger of factions. And what he was talking about was, he was arguing for a strong central government so that a majority couldn't oppress a minority. And we hear that all the time about the Senate. But I think that, again, is not really thinking about, who are the actual oppressed minority groups in the US, right? It's not the current Republican Party. And so I think that, yes, the Senate was designed to be different than the House. That, yes, there's institutional design meant to create some degrees of separation between the popular will and policy. But I think it's disingenuous to say that the intention of the framers was to allow a minority to be the governing majority, and to create institutions that allow that to continue.
I'd like to ask you all about this word. In one of the articles I read in preparation for this talk, I read a claim that the last successful Republican filibuster was in 2014, but the Democrats successfully blocked legislation more than 100 times during the Trump administration. And they've changed the words. When Republicans are filibustering, it's obstruction. When Democrats filibuster, it's the resistance and a virtuous thing. So how would the Republicans and the Democrats on this panel like to respond to that? And the ever so objective and neutral professor.
Well, the filibuster became everyday tactic by the Republican Party when Obama was elected. It became a routine activity, right? Routine technique to block whatever he wanted. So that was the foundation for the Democrats changing the rule then when they had control to accept everyone out except for Supreme Court. So when it became an everyday tactic, that was the beginning of the end, I think, of using the filibuster for deliberate consideration of compromise.
And again,
we're down to our last few minutes, so I'm going to give each of you a chance to say a few last words to our audience. Laura, you were about to speak. Why don't you go ahead here?
I say it became an everyday technique when it was easy to do, when it was just about the number of votes, nothing more. And I think really there's something to be said for careful consideration of change, and moderating some of the things that are coming out of the House or that are coming even from the states. And I'm all about federalism and states' rights as well. But I think just being very careful about the changes that we make is important.
Thanks. Megan, you have a few words to say to our audience before we start?
Yeah, I think my governing principle here is probably to lay it out on the table that I am pro-democracy and pro-political equality. And I know everybody is. But that's how I'm thinking of the filibuster at this moment in time and in the last few sessions of Congress. And that I have concerns that the things that are coming out of the states and the things that are coming out of Congress are that there are measures coming out of Congress that are going to protect ballot access and things like that. And there are measures in the states that are not. And we know how that played out in history. And so to the degree that the filibuster prohibits political equality, I think that it's time to reconsider and reform.
Okay. And Bob, what would you like to say to our audience?
I'd like to reform it, not eliminate it. I'd change the rule from 60 to 55. I'd require the senator using it to be on the floor and to speak.
Okay. Well, thank you all. In parting, I started with Jimmy Stewart in a 1939 film. I would like to recommend to you A Filibuster on Parks and Recreation. It's all about a plot to Star Wars. It goes on forever and ever. Very entertaining. And there's one proposal we didn't consider today. I read one that would flip the formula. Instead of 60 votes to close debate, 40 votes to keep the debate going. That was an interesting proposal. Well, thank you all for joining us on Ethical Perspectives on the News. Thank you, Megan, Laura, and Bob for joining us today, and hope to see you on the next program. You in the audience, and I hope these guests will join us for other discussions as well. Thank you. Goodbye. Bye-bye.